I'm happy to be here. I come at this as something of an outsider. I'm trained as a classicist. My most ardent academic interest is the city of Rome, and so you'll be hearing very little about the Egyptianness of Egyptian obelisks and more about what Roman emperors and popes did with those obelisks in later times. I don't profess to have any expertise or even scant knowledge of the obelisks as Egyptian monuments. I'll share my screen. And since I'm informed that we have only a scant 3 hours at our disposal this evening, I'll have to go quickly. Oh, only an hour? All right, well, it'll be a blitzkrieg then. If you've been to Rome, you've undoubtedly noticed the obelisks. They're one of the unique features of the city of Rome, and just inherently decorative, the way everything Italian seems to be. These obelisks, the Egyptian obelisks, number 13. Tonight, it's not going to be possible to look at them all simply because each of them has such a distinctive and elaborate history. When you look at them, there are 9 that are attested in ancient sources, and so we know something about when they were put up and where they were in antiquity. And there are 4 others that are small and evidently didn't rate in any of the sources that we have. For example, the elder Pliny tells us a lot about obelisks. We learn a thing or two from Suetonius, and then there are topographical catalogs, the regionary catalogs of later antiquity, where we learn about them as well. The ones that I want to look at tonight are the first 7 of the 13, and in a way, if you get the story of the first 7, you understand a lot about how obelisks in Rome have gotten there and have been reused. The story is immensely long if you try to tell it in its entirety. The earliest obelisk in Rome dates from 1400 BC. It was erected by Thutmose IV at Karnak in the 15th century. The first obelisks were brought from Egypt to Rome in 10 BC by the Emperor Augustus. The last was brought by the Emperor Constantius II in 357. And then we have a very long period with no information at all about the obelisks. And then starting in the 15th century and with a real spike, as it were, in the 16th century, they come back on the scene. So what we'll be focusing on is this period from the time of Augustus, from 10 BC, down into the golden age of obelisks in Rome, which is the 16th and the 17th and the 18th centuries. The story begins for us with the Roman Republic. I'm going to give just a little thumbnail sketch of what happened at the end of the Roman Republic. It ended badly, an orgy of civil bloodshed that involved a lot of foreign conquest at the same time. If you studied Roman history, you know that Julius Caesar was effectively the last of a series of warlords who climbed to perpetual dictatorship over a heap of corpses. Now, his perpetual dictatorship was implemented in February of 44 BC, and within a month, he had been murdered by his peers in the Senate. And this set off a power struggle in Rome. The 2 principal contenders for the position of Caesar were his lieutenant, Mark Antony, and his great-nephew and heir, Gaius Octavius, a much younger man, only 18 at the time that Caesar was killed. There's a long détente that involves some rather vivid episodes involving Antony and Cleopatra. Antony, who left Italy to live with Cleopatra in Alexandria. And over this 12-year détente between the murder of Caesar and the denouement of this détente, the tensions grew until in 31 BC. So this is 12 years after the assassination, 13 years after the assassination of Caesar. There was a battle off the west coast of Greece at Actium. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, they fled to Egypt and soon committed suicide. So Egypt was really a very important place in the establishment of the regime that, that Gaius Octavius, whom we know as Augustus, established on the ruins of the Roman Empire. Egypt was really in itself a trophy for Octavius Augustus after his defeat. In 27 BC, he takes the name Augustus. He goes from being just a contender for the universal power to the successful wielder of it. And we think of him as the first emperor. That's an anachronistic label for many reasons, but there was an important watershed between the dictatorship of Caesar, the kind of interregnum or chaos of the years between Caesar and Augustus, and then Augustus's recreation of Rome on a new basis that we can, for our purposes, call the Roman Empire. So there's a real logic in the commencement of this this custom of purloining Egyptian monuments as ornaments for the city of Rome. They were effectively trophies for Augustus's victory over Cleopatra, always positioned as a victory over Cleopatra. Of those obelisks that we know about in antiquity, there are 4 that can be associated with Augustus. And I'm going to use the Italian names for these, the Obelisco Flaminio and the Obelisco Campense, sometimes called the solar obelisk, are known to have been mounted or erected by Augustus because they bear his inscriptions. And then there are 2 others, the Esquilin and the Quirinal obelisk, Obelisco Esquilino and Obelisco Quirinale, which are associated with Augustus, but possibly not brought to Rome by him. The Obelisco Campense, that means the obelisk of the Campus Martius, is called the solar obelisk because it was used as the gnomon of a large calendar that Augustus laid out in the Campus Martius, and the design of it and even the calibrations of it were copied from an exemplar in Alexandria. So it was an intrinsically Hellenistic Egyptian monument that was replicated in Rome, despite the difference in latitude and the supervening inaccuracies because of it. But the main thing was it was a monument of triumph over Egypt on the part of Augustus. And then the second trophy obelisk brought by Augustus was the Flaminian obelisk, the Obelisco Flaminio. The reason for that name is because of where it ended up in the late Renaissance. Now, if you look at these, the Obelisco Campense dates to a very late period. I'm not even sure how to pronounce this pharaoh's name. I'll say it Psamtik II. But the Flaminian obelisk is really quite venerable. It goes back to the reigns of Seti and his son Ramses II. So it dates to the late 13th century BC. And this obelisk was put up in the Circus Maximus. Both of them were mounted in 10 BC, which was the 20th anniversary of the final subjugation of Egypt by Rome in the aftermath of the Battle of Actium. I have a special interest in inscriptions, and there's not enough time tonight to really dwell on them as lovingly as I'd like to. The inscriptions on both of the obelisks that I'm speaking about now are identical, and there are 2 copies on each monument. So even though the obelisk, the inscriptions are rather battered, with 4 exemplars, it's possible to reconstitute the text. Now, if you are interested in Latin inscriptions, as you should be, there's actually a very good book on that subject written by me, and it involves the inscriptions not only on obelisks, but every other really species of public monument in the city of Rome. So I will shamelessly refer to that as I move through. This is a spread from the section on the Obelisco Flaminio, and you can see there's a little kind of rough and ready edition of the inscription here, indicating missing letters and so forth, and then a translation here. Imperator Caesar Augustus, son of the divine, supreme pontiff, acclaimed imperator for the 12th time, consul for the 11th, vested with the tribunician power for the 14th, upon the subjection of Egypt to the authority of the Roman people, gave this as a gift to the sun. It's a wonderful document. It captures so much about the spirit of of Roman imperialism. That reference to the sun is significant because both of the obelisks taken by Augustus came from Heliopolis, the major solar sanctuary. And so not only do these trophies represent the victory of Augustus over Egypt, but they also represent his piety, because although he uprooted them from their original context in Heliopolis, he rededicated them in Rome to the sun. And there are two further things about that that are very interesting. One is, of course, that the Obelisco Campense is actually the gnomon of a solar calendar. So it has a direct solar connection, but the one in the Circus Maximus does as well, because the Romans drew what seems to us perhaps a somewhat strained and fanciful analogy between the course of the chariots around the track, the arena of the Circus Maximus, and the career of the planets in the solar system. And of course, there's a little bit of confusion there, because they didn't think that the planets were going around the sun, but there was definitely a solar component to that. So the Flaminian and the Flaminio and the Campense, we know were brought to Rome by Augustus. The Esquilino and the Quirinale are associated with Augustus for a good reason, and that is that at least by the 4th century, by the time of Ammianus Marcellinus, these obelisks are mentioned as having stood before the mausoleum of Augustus. Since Pliny doesn't mention them and they don't show up in Suetonius or any of the other earlier sources, it's probably a pretty good bet that they were a later addition. So these are, we could call them sub-Augustan obelisks. We don't know for sure when they were put up. So if we do a little census here of where we are, we know that Augustus put up one obelisk in the Circus Maximus. We know that he put up a second one in the Campus Martius on his solar calendar, and then there are two others associated with him, whether correctly or not, because they were mounted in front of his mausoleum. All right. The next obelisk that we get intelligence of in the sources is the Vatican obelisk, the Obelisco Vaticano, and it was brought to Rome by Caligula in the 30s AD, 30s CE, on a massive ship that was constructed for the purpose. And it was set up not within the city, or at least within on the eastern side of the Tiber River, but rather in the Vatican. And the Ager Vaticanus was an open area to the west of the city where there were villas, and the villa where this obelisk was erected had belonged to Caligula's mother, the elder Agrippina. And we're told that Caligula, followed by Nero, laid out a hippodrome in this villa, on the grounds of this villa. And the reason we know where that location is that this obelisk is apparently the only obelisk brought to Rome by the Romans that actually remained upright through the centuries. And we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. One of the great problems of ancient Roman topography is that there appear to be no archaeological remains of the circus of Gaius and Nero, except for the obelisk itself. What the archaeology can tell us is that the area that the circus, this area, the villa, was abandoned by probably the end of the 1st century AD already. And by the end of the 2nd century, the whole zone had been invaded by tombs. As the population of Rome boomed, real estate for tombs, mausolea, was really just out of control. And so this is a big tomb that's actually constructed right on the spina, the partition of that circus, and these are the tombs over here, among which was believed to be the tomb of St. Peter. Probably not. Now, in the 4th century, so that would be a full 3 centuries after Caligula laid this circus out because St. Peter was believed to be buried here. The Emperor Constantine leveled the entire zone and built an enormous basilica, the Basilica of St. Peter. And through the centuries, the Vatican obelisk, which had been on the spina, on the partition, continued to stand there. It has an inscription on it. It actually has two dedicatory inscriptions dating from Antiquity. And this enhanced image shows the palimpsest, that is, the layering of these two inscriptions. The original one is the darker one, and then you can see other ones there. And if you are interested in that, there's a book where you can find out. The older inscription dates to the Augustan period. This obelisk was actually taken and mounted in Alexandria in the time of Augustus. And then over that inscription, Caligula added a different dedication. So the old inscription was kind of scooped out. You can see here how the surface of the obelisk has been scooped out so that the new text could be inserted over the old text, or layered, incised over the old text. I'm sorry we don't have more time to spend on that. It's interesting. The Lateran obelisk was the last of the great imperial obelisks. So the last that was brought by a Roman emperor. And it was put up in the Circus Maximus, like the first one, by Constantius II. He was one of the sons of Constantine, and like many of the emperors of his period, he made very few visits to the city of Rome. And the erection of this obelisk in the Circus Maximus was on the occasion of a visit to Rome in the year 357 rather. So the smaller obelisk in the Circus Maximus was put up by Augustus in 10 BC. That's the Obelisco Flaminio. And the larger one was put up by Constantius II in 357 CE. And that's the Obelisco Lateranense, because it ended up at the Lateran Basilica, as we'll see. All right, so I said it was going to be a blitzkrieg. What I hope to have established here is that a number of obelisks were brought to Rome in the ancient period between the 3 centuries, essentially between Augustus and Constantine and his sons. Now, between 357 and 1000 CE, we really have no direct evidence of what the state of the obelisks was. It's like most of the monuments of Imperial Rome. It really is a dark ages because of the lack of sources. By 1000 CE, there is a mention of the monuments of Rome in a book by a man who called himself Magister Gregorius, one of these adventurous monks who came to Rome and wrote a book. He mentions the Vatican obelisk, and most scholars infer that because the Vatican obelisk is the only one that he saw, and he was talking about marvels, that the others were already collapsed and more or less invisible. I think that's a reasonable inference. So out of all the 9, actually 13 obelisks that were brought to Rome, and there were more of them too, only the Vatican obelisk was left standing by the millennium, the turn of the millennium. The Romans began to find the collapsed obelisks and to re-erect them around the year 1400. And the earliest that we know of is called the Obelisco Mateiano, because it ended up in the hands of a minor aristocratic family called the Mattei. And I'll have a picture about that. Like most of these obelisks, of course, it was set up in one place in antiquity, discovered, and then re-erected in an entirely different place. For the Obelisco Mateiano, we have to go to the Capitoline Hill, which in antiquity was really the center of Rome in every sense. In early medieval and modern Rome, and this is the map by Giovanni Battista Noli, published in 1748, you can see that the Capitoline Hill is really kind of on the periphery of the city. And when you get much to the south and the east of the Capitoline, you're out in open country. Nonetheless, the Capitoline Hill had retained its mystique as a seat of power for the medievals, for Magister Gregorius. It was really suffused with magic. But the Romans, the medieval Romans and the early modern Romans did associate it with the traditions of republican government. And so when the Roman commune, as it's called, the civic government of Rome, declared its independence from the papacy, it was almost inevitable that the Capitoline Hill would become the center of their patriotic aspirations as an opposition to the Lateran and to the Vatican, which were the great seats of papal power. This is what the Capitoline Hill looked like in the 1530s, about a century after this obelisk was put up. And that's when it's really around the year 1500 that we begin to get graphic documentation like this. You can see the major monuments of the medieval and modern Capitoline. There's the great Basilica of Santa Maria in Araceli. There's Palazzo Senatorio with its big tower, and then Palazzo dei Conservatori, which was the seat of the municipal officials of Rome. Looking from the opposite side, so from the steps of the basilica, if you were standing there and looked across, the obelisk would be in the foreground and there was a little column. So what we're seeing in this picture is a view across the piazza of the Capitol from the steps of the Church of Santa Maria in Araceli. This is a reconstructive drawing that shows the basilica, the steps with the obelisk beside them, the Palazzo dei Conservatori and the Palazzo Senatorio. That piazza is virtually unrecognizable in this form because in the 1530s, it was reorganized really by Michelangelo. And so he conferred a certain regularity and civic dignity on it. You can see where the obelisk was, there's no obelisk. And that obelisk was taken off the Capitoline Hill. It was given to an aristocratic family by the commune. It was given to the Mattei family and moved from the Capitoline down to the Celian Hill, which was really out in the country at this time. If you've been to Rome, you're probably familiar with where the Colosseum is. The Colosseum was out in the country, and the Celian Hill is the hill immediately to the south of it. The Mattei had a villa there and took the obelisk and put it in their gardens. And even though it's been moved more than once since the 16th century, it's still there today. So something that happens with great frequency in the case of these obelisks is that they were put in one place in antiquity, discovered, and then taken to a different place for particular reasons. The second obelisk that I want to look at is the Obelisco Macuteo, and it's called that because it was discovered in the vicinity of the Church of San Macuto. These two obelisks happen to be twins. That is, they both came from Heliopolis and they both have inscriptions of Ramses II. They probably were originally displayed as a pair, although we can't be sure of that. We do have some graphic documentation of the obelisk when it was erected in Piazza di San Macuto. And that was in the mid-1400s, again, in the context of a gesture of civic independence on the part of the Roman civic authorities against papal domination. So these obelisks were being used in an early period as counterintuitive as it seems, as sort of assertions of communal independence vis-a-vis tyrannical papacy. Where is Piazza San Macuto? The Capitol is down here, we just saw, on the very edges. Piazza di San Macuto is right in the heart of of medieval Rome, and it's really not surprising at all that this obelisk as an emblem of communal independence would be put up in the very heart of the commune, the Comune di Roma. This is the site on the Noli plan. Once again, this magnificent document of medieval and early modern Rome. That's the little church of San Macuto and the Piazza di San Macuto. Notice these monuments around it. There's the Pantheon, probably the second most famous monument in Rome after the Colosseum. This is Piazza Navona and the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva and the church of Sant'Ignazio. So those are monuments that are sort of keys here. Sant'Ignazio, Santa Maria sopra Minerva, the Pantheon, here's the church of San Macuto, and there's the little obelisk standing next to the great basilica of Sant'Ignazio, where it had been put up 3 centuries and more before Noli, actually about almost exactly 3 centuries before Noli made his map. And so it's still there. That obelisk was dug up, erected here in probably the 1450s, and then in the early 1700s moved to the piazza in front of the Pantheon. So tracking these obelisks over time and in their peregrinations through the city of Rome is it's an endeavor and a joy in itself. So on Noli's map, which was made in 1748, the obelisk, which was moved in 1711, does not appear in the piazza, but instead is shown in plan in the fountain in front of the Pantheon, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so Piazza di San Macuto. Why was there an obelisk there waiting to be dug up in the early Renaissance around 1400? The answer is that if you take the Noli map and look under it to what was there in Antiquity, instead of Piazza Navona, you have the Stadium of Domitian. Of course, the Pantheon is there and always has been. You look over in the region of Piazza di San Macuto, you see a monumental complex here that is the sanctuary of the Egyptian gods Isis and Serapis. This is the way it's reconstructed. It was an odd-looking precinct, and I'm sure that Egyptologists can interpret the configuration of it much better than I can. For our purposes, the important thing is that it was a center of Egyptian cult in Rome. It was introduced in the time of Augustus. It was banned later, probably under Tiberius, and then revived with a vengeance by the Emperor Domitian at the end of the 1st century AD or CE. And if you look closely, you can see a number of obelisks. It's unsure exactly how many obelisks there were. This is, these letters here show a fragment of a marble plan of Rome that was made around 200 CE. And these little dots here are sometimes interpreted as signifying the position of obelisks. In this reconstruction of the Iseum, the shrine of Isis, you can see the obelisks are placed on either side of a dromos or processional way, which seems to me on general principles to be more likely. And if you superimpose the plan of medieval and early modern Rome on it, you'll see that Piazza di San Macuto is actually on the northeastern corner of the former precinct of Isis. So is the Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and it looks to me as though the transept of that church took advantage of foundations that were under there. That's meant to indicate a line of obelisks, and I think that the almost inevitable conclusion is that in Piazza di San Macuto or in a neighboring house, somebody dug deep enough to find the corner of an obelisk, and they dug it up and put it up right there. This proved to be an extremely prolific source of obelisks for Rome. And there's the obelisk. So the Obelisco Macuteo and the Obelisco Mateano are the first of several recovered from the site of the old Iseum, the old imperial sanctuary of Isis in the Campus Martius. Uh, the four smallest obelisks of Rome, and so that would be the Mateiano, which we looked at first, the Macuteo, and then two others, the Minerveo, the elephant obelisk, and the Obelisco dei Dogali, which we won't be looking at, all came from the Iseum. And it's almost certain, I think, that the Obelisco Agonale, which is in Piazza Navona, also came from there. Bigger. And when we first hear about it, it's actually outside the city of Rome, but I think that's where it came from. In the late 16th century, the papacy had found its footing. The late Middle Ages were hard on the papacy. Popes spent a long time in virtual exile in Avignon. There was a schism with three pretenders to the papal throne. In 1420, the papacy officially reestablished itself in Rome. And of course, that was highly controversial. The Obelisco Macuteo, probably a direct response of the commune to the reassertion of papal authority. But a century on, and the popes had completely dominated the city of Rome and also a considerable territory. And it's one of the late Renaissance popes, Pope Sixtus V, who is responsible for, I'll call it the golden age of Rome's obelisks, with all of the problematic implications that has. Four obelisks were put up by Pope Sixtus V, Peretti, a terrible man for reasons that I won't go into, definitely an autocrat, and a throwback to the worst, I think, of the medieval church. But he was a very ambitious urbanist. And so he managed, in a brief pontificate of just 5 years, to get four obelisks, of which two were truly colossal, re-erected in different locations from where they'd been in antiquity. The first, I keep having to move my little bar up here. The first of them is the Obelisco Vaticano, which we've already looked at. And that takes us out to the Vatican, which was a peripheral location, still is. The Obelisco Vaticano was, as I said, the only obelisk that we can be certain had stood without being toppled since antiquity. And it was still there beside the basilica that Constantine built. And by the 15th century, the whole neighborhood of the Vatican had really been developed. There was a papal palace, there were fortifications that had been put in the 9th century after Rome was sacked by Saracens. And the walled precinct extended all the way from the Vatican itself down to Castel Sant'Angelo, the mausoleum of Hadrian, and included a little walled city called the Borgo. The obelisk was still in situ beside the basilica that had been built by Constantine. About the year 1500, 1503, Pope Julius II determined that the basilica was so compromised statically that it needed to be pulled down and replaced. He wanted to build a big modern Renaissance temple in its place. And most of the evidence we have about this, it's a series of etchings and prints and drawings and watercolors that show the 150-year progress of the demolition of the Constantinian Basilica of St. Peter and the rise of the Julian Basilica, the basilica commenced by Pope Julius II. And there you can see the tip of the obelisk still standing off to the side of this, what is a very complex group of buildings around the Basilica of St. Peter. Julius, who was a good Renaissance man, wanted a completely symmetrical, centrally planned church in the Renaissance style. The church took 150 years to build, and by the time it was done, it was not in the Renaissance style, but in a Latin cross that was sort of the calling card of the Counter-Reformation architecture. It represented the cross of Christ with its long arm, long staff, and the cross. So for all this time, there was what must have been the surreal spectacle The massive vaults begun by Bramante, completed by Michelangelo, of the new church, coexisting with the carcass of the Constantinian Basilica, the nave, which it took an awfully long time for the authorities at the Vatican to decide to actually demolish. Such an act of impiety was it. The old nave was only demolished in 1606, and that's over a century after Julius II had begun. And so for all that time, it looks like a ruin, but these are actually the vaults constructed by Bramante and taken over by his successors down to Michelangelo. There's the tomb that had been in the middle of the circus, and then the obelisk still there. It's a huge granite monolith, and it was an effort, I think, of Herculean proportions for Domenico Fontana, who was the Pope's architect, better engineer than architect, who uprooted the obelisk. He designed and constructed a massive derrick to transport it, and then put it into a new location in front of the basilica, so that it could be a proper monument to the Christian church that was rising there. So this fresco, a little bit distorted because it's on the curved surface of the ceiling, shows the front part of the basilica still standing. You can see the pitched roof of the Constantinian nave, and there you can see the drum of Michelangelo's dome rising, but still open to the air, and the obelisk standing in front of it. Now today, when you go there, you'll see something like this, of course. That is the obelisk in front of the dome. But I thought that this foggy picture captures what it looked like before the dome was complete. It's got some fabulous inscriptions. Sixtus V transferred the obelisk, once dedicated in unholy reverence to the gods of the heathen, to the threshold of the apostles. He even exorcised the demons of Egypt from the obelisk. That's why I say he was a man of truly medieval temper. And if you're interested in all of that, there are translations in my book. Okay, the Esquilin obelisk, the Obelisco Esquilino, was the second of the Sistine obelisks. This is one of the two that had decorated the tomb of Augustus, and it had long fallen and been buried. And when it was discovered, it was pulled up and taken to the Esquilin Hill, where another important basilica is located, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, way out on the edges, the eastern edges of Rome, one of the big pilgrimage basilicas. And of course, it too has its own inscriptions. And one thing that becomes more elaborate as time goes on is the historical accounts of the obelisks. So there was some knowledge of these ancient obelisks, and you can see it was dedicated to Augustus at his mausoleum, then overturned, broken up into numerous pieces, et cetera, and restored and erected here in more auspicious wise, dedicated to the cross, which brings salvation. So a very conscious counterpoint between the original unclean dedication of the obelisks to the heathen gods and their purification and rededication to the one true God. The Lateran obelisk, which is the biggest and the oldest in Rome, was also moved, and it's missing probably close to a third of its bottom. They simply couldn't, it was too badly damaged, so it's truncated. And if you look at it, you can imagine that it probably, the entire shaft probably went down to about where that date is. This was the colossal obelisk that had been placed in the Circus Maximus by Constantius II in 357. And there you can see it by comparison with the other obelisks, by far the largest of them. And it was carried all the way out to the Lateran Basilica. The Lateran Basilica is the seat of the Bishop of Rome in his capacity as the bishop there. The Vatican was long just a memorial church to St. Peter. It was not really the residence of the popes. or their most important church. And so the Lateran had the dignity of the kind of the mother church of Western Christendom. There's the basilica and the palace that was built by Domenico Fontana for Sixtus V, and you can see the footprint of the obelisk there, and painting which suggests the almost rural conditions that obtained in that part of the city of Rome and through the entire periphery down to early modern times. There it is today with its inscription falsely claiming that Constantine was baptized on this spot, and that the obelisk commemorated his adoption of Christianity. There was a whole, I have to say, a whole lot of fake news around Constantine and Christianity that propagated itself through the Middle Ages and the early modern period. You want to read about it? It's in the book. And then finally, the Obelisco Flaminio, and this is the one that was the first one that we looked at that was put up by Augustus. That's the one that was put up in the Circus Maximus in 10 BCE by Augustus. So the counterpart of the Obelisco Campense. And the reason it's called the Obelisco Flaminio is that it was moved all the way from the Circus Maximus, which is, down here, up to the opposite end of town, by the Porta Flaminia. The long straight street that you see going up here is the Via Lata, Broadway, which at the Porta Flaminia becomes the Via Flaminia, the Great North Road that led up to northern Italy and points beyond. So it's an important place because northern visitors coming to Rome invariably entered in pre-modern times, not by the squalid Stazione Termini over here, but rather in a carriage coming through the Porta Flaminia. And so this obelisk dignifies that spot, 2.75 kilometers from its fine spot. And the inscriptions predictably celebrate its dedication to the cross. And again, so consecrated in the Circus Maximus by Caesar Augustus in unholy rite to the sun, broken and buried in pitiable ruin, etc., etc. They're very eloquent. These obelisks put up by Sixtus V were all in peripheral locations, and these locations were significant. All of them corresponded to churches that were on the pilgrimage route. There were 7 great pilgrimage churches in medieval, I suppose they're still active as such, and Sixtus envisioned a great network of long, straight boulevards that would link the 7 pilgrimage basilicas of Rome, and that the intersections, or the important nodes in this network, would be marked by obelisks. So the obelisks that he put up all were thought out with respect to this plan, which was never completely finished, but we're thankful to have all those obelisks in such picturesque locations. The 4 little obelisks, as I say, all come from the sanctuary of Isis in the Campus Martius, and then also the Obelisco Agonale almost certainly does. This Obelisco Agonale, that name refers to Piazza Navona, which is derived ultimately from the Greek word agon, which means a competition, contest, and refers to the athletic competitions that took place in the Stadium of Domitian that is responsible for the footprint. This is one of the imposter obelisks. It was manufactured locally, and the hieroglyphs, as I'm told, contain a hymn to Domitian and the Flavian dynasty, and it's not very well done. So somebody who knows hieroglyphs can maybe look into that. That obelisk was resurrected by Pope Innocent X, Pamphili. He came from one of the noble families of late medieval and early modern Rome. And just take a quick look at his coat of arms there with the dove, the olive branch, and the 3 lilies. The obelisk was erected at the center of Piazza Navona. This is Piazza Navona before Innocent X. in the 16th century. This is Piazza Navona after Innocent X. Not only did he have Bernini build the Fountain of the Four Rivers and erect the obelisk, but he also reconstructed his family's ancestral palace, Palazzo Doria Pamphili, and he reconstructed the Basilica of Sant'Agnese, Saint Agnes. He turned this piazza into, it had been an important market. He turned it into effectively Rome's biggest outdoor salon. It was almost like a room of Palazzo Pamphili, an amazing space. And of course, the jewel of Piazza Navona is the Fountain of the Four Rivers. It's also a monument to the church militant, in the sense that the 17th century was when missionaries, Jesuits in particular, were propagating the gospel in the four corners of the world. And so the four rivers, each of them is emblematic of a particular region that is undergoing evangelization at that time: the Nile, the Ganges, the Danube, and the Rio de la Plata, which I would not know about if it weren't for this fountain. It's in South America. That obelisk almost certainly came from the Iseum, and that's the original location of it. What we know about it is that Maxentius, who came 2 centuries after Domitian, took an obelisk for his villa on the Via Appia south of Rome. And this, again, is almost certain to have been that obelisk. It was on the spina of another private hippodrome, much like the one in the Vatican. This was a thing, having a hippodrome in your villa. And that's where Innocent X had it dug up in the 1650s and taken back to Rome. So that obelisk was probably right there. Again, it's in this area that was heavily built up in the Middle Ages and early modern time. And I think, kind of ironically, after a very long sojourn on the Via Appia, some miles south of Rome, ended up just 500 meters from its original location. So it was here and ends up just a few streets over. And it's got some pretty good inscriptions as well. I said note the coat of arms because you have to know that coat of arms in order to be able to appreciate the force of this inscription. The innocent dove subdues the guilty beasts of Egypt, bearing the olive of peace and crowned with the lilies of virtue. In setting up the obelisk as a trophy to herself, she triumphs at Rome. It's splendid, just splendid. The Obelisco Minerveo is another one of these obelisks from the Iseum. Now, I see it's coming on 8 o'clock, but we started 5 minutes late, and I was promised an hour and 15 minutes, so that's what I planned for. This is, again,
Professor Lansford, yes. Yeah, you could keep on going for another 10, 15 minutes if you would.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Also from Heliopolis, also with inscriptions of Ramses. After Sixtus V, who put up all those obelisks and planned all those roads, Alexander VII was probably the next great urbanist, almost a century later. He's most famous for commissioning Bernini's great colonnade at Piazza di San Pietro, St. Peter's Square. Why they call it a square, I don't know. He is responsible for the Obelisco Minerveo, and it's so called because it's mounted in front of the Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. So here, just a stone's throw really from Piazza di San Macuto. And in fact, the obelisk was dug up in the convent, the garden of the convent, attached to Santa Maria sopra Minerva. And that is, bullseye in the middle of the sanctuary of Isis. So this is another one of the many obelisks that was given up or disgorged by the former sanctuary of Isis. It's probably one of the most celebrated of Rome's obelisk simply because it has this quaint, I think I could call it, quaint elephant by Bernini, which doesn't look very much like any elephant that I've ever seen. The elephant seems like such an amazing, it's just exactly the right choice, but it took a while to come to that solution. And I think we can all be grateful that the elephant finally prevailed as the design. The problem was putting a solid over a void was very much against Vitruvian orthodoxy. And so in order to avoid putting a solid over a void, a very heavy drapery was added to the elephant so that there wouldn't appear to be this contravention of architectural decorum. You can see there doesn't appear to be a void there. The elephant is said to symbolize spiritual fortitude in the very battered inscription right there at street level, which talks about it is proof that to uphold sound wisdom is the part of the sturdy mind. So look at the elephant holding the obelisk and meditate on wisdom. I'm going to close the circle here. The Obelisco Macuteo had stood, by the time we're where we are now in the chronology of the obelisk, it had stood in Piazza di San Macuto for fully 300 years. And it's a reminder of what long time spans you have to get accustomed to when you look at Rome diachronically, starting in Antiquity. It's just an almost overwhelming chronology. So that obelisk was there for 3 centuries. We don't have many monuments in this country that have stood in the same place for 3 centuries, at least monuments of the current regime. It was finally moved by a pope who was not a particularly ambitious urbanist, Pope Clement XI Albani. He decided to take that obelisk from Piazza di San Macuto, which is over here. There you can see the obelisk we were just looking at, Obelisco Minerveo with the Basilica of Santa Maria. And that, of course, is the Pantheon with its fountain in front of it and the Obelisco Macuteo on top of it. It's an enchanting place. It was almost destroyed in the Napoleonic period, but thank goodness it was preserved. Before the obelisk was moved there was a fountain, but there was nothing else. And I think Clement XI rightly saw that it needed something. There was something missing there. And this obelisk is just the perfect scale for the place. So he had it moved just a couple of streets from Piazza di San Macuto to Piazza della Rotonda, which is the piazza in front of the Pantheon. And there it stands, perfectly scaled for this, again, very intimate little piazza. It's kind of the opposite of the Piazza Navona, which is a very expansive place. This is one of the chamber-like piazzas of Rome, and it has a, I think, pleasingly unpretentious dedicatory inscription. Clement XI, Supreme Pontiff, for the embellishment of the fountain in the square in the year of salvation, 1711, 11th of his office. Maybe we wouldn't want every inscription to be that prosaic, but it is a breath of fresh air after the bombast of some of the earlier inscriptions. Now, the main reason that I stopped here is that I didn't have 3 hours, but as you can tell, it would have been easy. And in fact, I first planned this talk to cover all 13 obelisks, and then it became increasingly apparent that that was not going to work, and my husband advised me not to go on for 3 hours. So I have a kind of artificial stopping point. I thought the Obelisco Macuteo was a good place to stop because it's the first obelisk that was erected, and then it kind of also marks the end of an era. 1700 and the pontificate of Clement XI really sort of marks the end of the protracted Renaissance in terms of architecture, 3 centuries. And starting with Clement XI, for example, it became illegal to pillage the ruins of ancient buildings for building materials, which the popes had done for 300 years since about the year 1400. And then too, if you look ahead at the next big obelisk that was put up, the Obelisco Quirinale, 1786, it was mounted there by a pope who was in conflict with Napoleon and who died in exile. Pope Pius VI died in exile in France in 1799. So Rome too is no longer a sort of little, independent, self-sustaining principality. It's been drawn into European power politics, much to its disadvantage. So, in any case, those are my reasons for stopping there, as artificial as they may seem. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. However, Dennis wants to handle that. I'll stop my share, and Dennis, just help me out here.
Sure. What I'd like to do is I'll read off the questions that did come in while you were lecturing, and then I'll open it up to the floor to everybody. First, from Laura Engel, how were the obelisks moved to Rome and erected within Rome?
Well, it was an extremely laborious operation. They were shipped, and we know that the ship that Caligula brought the Vatican obelisk in was so large that it was sunk in the mouth of the harbor at Ostia as part of the foundations of a lighthouse. So it was a massive vessel. From that point, the obelisks were taken on barges up to the quay, the port in Rome at the foot of the Aventine Hill. And then I don't really know, exactly what the winches and derricks look like that enable them to be moved, but they were offloaded from the ships and then rolled on tree trunks. Again, very laboriously, I assume with a lot of horsepower, to wherever their location was. So it was manpower intensive.
Okay, thank you. And then also from Laura, has Egypt ever asked for the obelisks to be returned?
I don't know. Italy has had a long and difficult relationship with Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and an obelisk was returned at the turn of this millennium to Aksum. The obelisk of Aksum was returned to Ethiopia. I am unaware, although I don't profess to keep up with this, whether Egypt has asked for any of them back. I mean, repatriation, of course, is in the air, the Elgin marbles, so it wouldn't surprise me, but I just haven't heard anything about it. Sorry.
Okay, and another question from Laura. Could you talk about the finials on the top of the obelisks?
Well, many of them involve heraldic symbolism. So components of the Pope's arms will find their way. So, for example, the obelisk of Piazza Navona, the Obelisco Agonale, has the dove, the Pamphili dove on top of it. There's a lot of punning, heraldry. So, for example, a pope who had a name with Monti in his name, even Chiaramonti, will have 3 little mounds that are like hills. So most of it is heraldic symbolism, and of course they're invariably surmounted by a cross on top of that.
Okay, thank you. And this is from Rhonda Hageman. Why did they feel it was necessary to put any figure beneath the Obelisco Minerveo? Was the base of the obelisk damaged?
No, well, the bases of all the obelisks were damaged, and one of the biggest evidences that they were deliberately toppled is all the ones that were re-erected by Sixtus V had evidence not only of burning, intense heat, but also of deliberate chiseling to round off the bottoms so that they couldn't be set back up. That was not the case with the smaller obelisks from the Iseum, which were, I'm sure they had been toppled, but there's no evidence of that same kind of violent treatment. I think that the whole thing about the elephant was it's kind of a tour de force to balance a heavy monolith on top of a piece of sculpture that has just 4 legs. And so I think that, there's more to be known about this than I know, but Bernini's original plan for the elephant configuration shows the obelisk on the back of the elephant, and it appears to, in some ways, defy gravity. So is that, I'm not sure I'm getting at the question. Would you reread that question, Dennis?
Why did they feel it was necessary to put any figure beneath the obelisk veil?
I think, I can't answer that question definitively, and I'm sure that there's documentation on it. It's a Baroque fantasy. It's just a folly of a kind that is typical in the arts of the 17th and the 18th
I kind of
centuries.
like your answer, but seemed like it's suspended in air. That kind of fits.
Yeah, it's a Baroque. You could, I think, subsume it under the rubric of Baroque theatricality and rhetoric. It's it's that kind of monument.
Great. Okay, this is a bit of a long one. It's from Beth Dusenberry. Among so many wonderful things you've touched on this evening, gosh, that is fascinating about the pseudo-hieroglyphic inscription on the obelisk in the Piazza Navona. Are there any other examples of garbled Egyptian inscriptions in Rome? Do they ever offer Latin translations? Why do you think the inscription on the obelisk was written?
I think we know that Domitian was a big devotee of Isis, and Isis was assimilated by what they call interpretatio Graeca or interpretatio Romana to Athena and Minerva, and so Isis is kind of the Egyptian Minerva, and Minerva was his patron goddess. So it doesn't surprise me that when he rebuilt the Iseum that he had a hymn to his own family, to Vespasian and his elder brother Titus and himself inscribed on it. I've never come across a translation of the hymn, and so I don't know what the particulars of it are or anything. I'm sure it's available. I don't know anything about hieroglyphics. The hieroglyphics were a matter of great speculation, and particularly in the 17th century, there was a German named Athanasius Kircher, or was it Kirchner? I think it was Kircher, a Jesuit who devoted a lot of effort to elucidating the mysteries of these artifacts. But Professor Dusenberry, I think you've reached the limits of my erudition with that question.
Thanks. Okay, this one's from Damien Priccolo. Do we know if there are more obelisks and how many that may still be buried in the area of the Serapeum precincts? If so, is there any evidence or speculation about their origins?
No. I think the problem is we don't really know what the layout of that sanctuary was, except in the broadest outlines, and most of our information comes from the marble plan that I briefly mentioned that was inscribed in the reign of Septimius Severus in the 190s CE, and so we know what the layout was. And then there's been this there are incised dots on that plan that appear that plausibly represent files of obelisks. And then the area has, as I said, disgorged half a dozen obelisks or more. And so I think that the chances are that there are more that they're just irretrievably buried beneath modern buildings, and we don't have any, as far as I know, any documentary evidence of any kind that would tell us more, about what they were, where they came from. There are a lot of obelisks that were apparently brought to Rome that didn't leave any kind of record. Only the biggest ones were attracted notice.
Okay, so you do think there could be some there buried and dug up someday in the future, huh?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, Imperial Rome is mostly entombed beneath medieval and modern Rome, so the obelisks would be the least of the artifacts that would that would come up, I think.
Okay, great. And last one from Russ Young. Why were the obelisks toppled?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's something that can't be answered definitively. However, as I say, the 4 obelisks that were re-erected by Sixtus V were inspected by a scholar whose name I can't remember. I think it was Michele Mercati, who made detailed notes about the appearance of them on excavation, and he's the one who noted this damage. The best guess is that it was during the Romano-Gothic conflict of the 530s and the 540s. Actually, it was from the 530s through the 550s. The Byzantine Gothic War for Italy. We know that the Goths camped outside Rome for weeks. They cut the aqueducts in the 530s. So part of there was some deliberate destruction of aqueducts, and the Goths and the Byzantines held Rome by turns. Rome changed hands in the 530s and the 540s, I believe 5 times, between the Byzantine forces and the Ostrogothic forces. And the best speculation that I've read is that just as they had destroyed what they could of the aqueducts, the Ostrogoths toppled the obelisks and vandalized them in such a way that they couldn't be set back up, at least very easily. But that's something that's just shrouded in night. We really can't know. I would call that a good, a plausible conjecture. It's not my conjecture, but it's plausible.
Okay, great. We had one late one come in. It's from Cassius Abraham. Is there a chance that there were any obelisks in the city during the Republic?
It's to say no is to argue from silence. It's an interesting question. Rome did have a very intensive diplomatic traffic with Hellenistic Egypt starting in the 270s BC, and Cleopatra resided in Rome for quite some time in the last generation of the Roman Republic. I think that if an obelisk had been brought, it would be such a spectacular thing that there would have been some record of it. I'm pretty comfortable saying no, just on that basis. It's a good question, Cash.
Okay.
But I don't think it can be definitively answered, but I would say I'm about 95% sure that the answer is no.
Okay.